So I'm going to start to take apart the trailing arm. I want to get the rust off of the trailing arm. I don't know how much of the spindle I'm going to actually take apart. I'm going to make that a decision after I get this trailing arm off and see what I'm up against. There's the obligatory cotter pin here that's holding the nut on in the back of the trailing arm. And of course, it's going to try to be difficult for me. The thing about cotter pins, they work well, but they can be a bear to get at. I'm going to have to find a pick to dig in there and try to get that out. It's not wanting to come out. So I was able to get a pick in behind the loop of the cotter pin, and instead of prying it, what I did was I just put the pick in behind the loop and I just gently tapped it with a hammer, and that pulled it far enough out that it's starting to be able to be pried. So it looks like that's going to come out with the help of maybe some needle nose pliers. There you go. Fortunately, it was rusted, but it wasn't rust bonded, I should say, in there. Now I got to find out what kind of a socket I need for that. It's probably going to work best with an impact wrench to take that off. So I've got a 1 1/16 inch socket from my 3/4 inch set that I bought at Harbor Freight. That's what the size of that nut is. So I have a reducer so that I can use it on the 1/2 inch impact drive. So what I found after taking that out is that the trailing arm is held on with 4 studs that come through this way. So they're attached behind the rotor. So in order to take that off, you've got to take the rotor off. Haven't quite decided whether I'm going to do that yet, but I think since I have to, I think I'm leaning towards doing it. So that's going to require me to drill out these 5 rivets. And as long as I put this back on this hub in the same position, I won't have a run-out problem. So what I'm going to do right now, so I don't forget, so I'm going to take my little die grinder and I'm going to put a nick on the hub and on the drum, so that when I go to put it back together, I can line those up and I'll have it in the same position and I won't have a run-out problem. So line those up, and they will be in the same position, hub versus rotor. So I'm switching to the right side trailing arm since that's already drilled at, so that I can keep the right and the left separated. I put 2 nicks on the drum and on the hub, and that way I won't confuse left from right. So I'm going to take that now and take that flange off the back like I did on the other side. I'm not going to video it since you've already seen how that's done. And I will come back whenever I've got this ready to address taking the trailing arm off of the spindle. So since I didn't really show how I got the cotter pin at, I'm just going to demonstrate it on this. This one is loose, it's not going to be a problem, but I'll show you what exactly I did with that pick to get the other one out, which was a little more difficult. I just inserted it behind the cotter pin, and it was much tighter than this. And I just took the hammer and tapped it, and as it went in, it pulled the cotter pin out enough so that I could then hook the needle nose plier into it. And I hope I'm not in the way. Once you get the needle nose plier into it, it should come out fairly easy. And of course, it's going to make me a liar. Honest, the other one came out easily. I'll just take and tap the pliers with a hammer. So that's what I did to take the cotter pin out. Just another tip that maybe you could use sometime. If you've been following along, you recall that this, because it had been taken out in the past, has a shim behind it. So that's another thing, since that's going to come off, that shim has to go back in the same place. And since I won't be painting the shim, it's stainless steel. That one is marked, and it happens to be marked exactly where the marks for the 2 little nicks I put in. So I'm going to line this all up, and while I'm doing this to make it obvious so that I don't put this on the wrong side, I'm going to make this a double mark. So all the double marks line up, and then on the other side there's single marks, they line up, and you shouldn't have a problem with run out. Okay, once you take off the brake drum, the hat, if you will, on the brake drum sits over these brake shoes. These brake shoes are for your parking brake. So I am going to try to pry that out. I'm going to need to get some kind of a tool to get that star wheel out of there. And it's a tight fit to get those springs back in on the brakes, but I have done it before. Hopefully it won't be a big problem. Worst that can happen in my case is I'll end up having to press the spindle out of the carrier, and then most people say it can't be done, but since there's no play in this, the setup is good. I don't have to worry about setup. All I have to worry about is putting it back in the same sequence. And the big problem why most people say you can't get it done is there's a seal between the bearing and the carrier. And you need to get that pushed back in place. You can't replace it if you don't pop the bearing out of the carrier. Or I shouldn't say that. If you don't remove the bearing from the spindle, you can't replace that. And I didn't remove the bearing from the spindle, but I used a trick to reseat that seal. Now, that seal is only holding wheel bearing grease in, and wheel bearing grease doesn't really break down to a liquid, so it doesn't want to run out. So as long as you can get it back in, it will seal well enough. So I've pressed the first spindle out of the trailing arm. That's the passenger side. That's the one I feel that has been worked on before, so it's probably the easy one. Once I got a way to support it, which wasn't easy, then it came out relatively easily. Didn't have to put much pressure on the pump. So what I've got is a 2x4 laying down, bridging the base of the press, and one vertical holding the press plate. So now that that's actually pressed out, I guess I should say the bond between that bearing seat and that is broken. This should come out pretty easily. Thought it would just stay on the ground there or on the table. I guess I'm going to need to pry that a little bit. The last time I did this, when I took it off, that came right off. There you have it. I have to fish the spacers and stuff out of there yet. Okay, my air hose is in the way of the spindle. So there's the spindle with the bearing. The grease seal is here. That's the one that I'm going to shim behind it so that I can press it back into the back of the carrier. So I am going to put that away and go grab the other trailing arm and try and press that out. So if you recall, the other side had a original rotor on it, and you can't support that trailing arm to press out the spindle without pulling that rotor off. So I had to drill out the rivets, and that was hard to do on center because they aren't necessarily on center. So after I got them drilled far enough that I was confident I was through the head, I just used a punch and on the air hammer and punched them out. Now, I was able to start lifting this rotor off of here but I couldn't turn it, probably because the heads of those rivets are hitting it, and it would only go part way, so I'm using a puller to pull it off. I did loosen it up a little bit with the air hammer, with the regular carpenter hammer's bit, before I did this. But I couldn't spin it, so I had to pull it off with the puller. And it's coming easily, only a little bit of drag, apparently, from the brake shoes. So I'll get that all the rest of the way off and try and set it up to press the spindle out. Now remember, I have marked this so I can put it on in the same orientation as it came off. I don't want to put a whole lot of pressure on that, because theoretically you could bend the brake rotor. So that wasn't taking a lot of pressure, so I wasn't in danger of bending it, I don't feel. So I'm going to set up the press, and then I'll video pressing that spindle out. So these two bolts, those bolts where the brake calipers get bolted on, and they only go about that far, and then they tighten up due to rust in the rest of the hole. So I'm going to do what I did on the other one, since I'm kind of refreshing the whole trailing arm. Is I'm going to take those out. They happen to be a 7/16 20 thread. I have a tap. I'm going to carefully line it up to make sure that I'm not cross-threading it, and I'm going to clean out those threads with the tap. My tap, and I don't think they're all necessarily this way, it's got a 1/4 inch square top on it. And I happen to have a 1/4 inch square nut socket. So it fits nicely on that. And I'm going to go make sure that that's in the frame. I could do it a little better than that. So that fits on there. And all I'm going to do, I've started it in several threads, and I'll do this to both bolts. Once I get it started nice and clean, then I'll just run the tap all the way down, clean out the rust from those threads, so that when I put it on, I know that I'm torquing it down to the caliper and not getting extra resistance from the thread that's rusty. Wants to move on me. So that's clean all the way through now, and I'm going to just take it out, do the other one, and set it up to press the spindle out, and then I'll video that. One thing, I'm going to mention it now so I don't forget to mention it later, is the flange that bolts to the half shaft has to be off, I believe, in order to press that. So I'm going to take that off and put the nut on just flush with the top of the shaft. I've had this off before, so it's only hand tight. that shaft's off. And be careful when you're handling this, there is a washer in here that nut sits on. So you want to make sure that you don't lose that. Okay. So I'll tap that other one, clean it out, and then set up the press. Okay, there's the setup. I'm going to slowly pump the press. This one is, as I expected, harder than the other one. Make sure I'm not hitting anything that's preventing it from coming out. And I strike that with a little hammer just to shock it a bit. I'm going to hit the I'm going to shut the video off a while and let that pressure set on there for a minute. So I must have had some interference with that top plate that I put in to protect the bolt here, because I loosened the pressure and went on it again, and I can see right down here that the spindle is being pushed out, and I'm not using much pressure at all. And there's a pop. That probably means it's done coming out. At the very least, I have to do something different, because my plate to protect the bolt was bottoming out on the trailing arm. So this is almost going to hit. Just lost one of my supports. So I'm going to take that off. It's loose now, and I will probably have to just pry it out like I did the other one. But that's what it takes to push them out. So interestingly enough, the bearing and the seal didn't come out on that side. Not 100% sure what that means. I'll have to do some investigating. But the next step here is going to be to take this parking brake stuff off. And I'm looking for a pair of pliers that I can't seem to locate. They're not in my toolbox. So these are your standard disc or drum brake type retainers on here that are a pain in the rear. You have to press them down and rotate them to unlock them, and there is a pin in the back, and on the forward side on both sides it's up in here where theoretically you can get your finger on it. It'd be nice if you had smaller hands than I have, but I put one finger through one of those holes and I've got the back of it, so I should be able to press down on this and rotate it. And that should come off. Okay, so that pin just fell out, and I just dropped the spring and retainer. There's no backing plate. The brake shoe itself acts as the backing plate to it. So now I'll go after the other one. And that's interesting because you can't get into that because the brake shoe retainer is blocking it, so you can't get a finger on the back, and it's not wanting to allow me to depress it far enough to get it to spin on that little tab. I'm going to have to somehow get two pairs of pliers in there, one to hold the tab and the other to turn the... I never did find my pliers, but I was able to get a pair of vice grips on it and then use my needle nose, push down with the vice grips and use my needle nose pliers to turn that pin. Unfortunately, it bent the retaining cup just a little bit, but I think it's perfectly fine function-wise. This looks a little different than my 74 did. My 74 had springs at the top. I don't know whether these are just missing or not, but there's two sides to this, so I might find out on the other side. Actually, there it is right there. It's supposed to be between there and it just broke. It's supposed to be between there and there, so I'll have to get a new spring. Probably end up having to buy all new hardware, which is probably not too bad since that retainer got bent. Now, one thing I've learned on the 74 is once I had these two clips off, that first of all I made note that all of the springs went in with the hook going down into these holes. But after I got that far, I found that I could just spread those apart and take them off as one unit. So there's the parking brake shoes. Those are fine since it's just used for parking. Now this little lever is for the parking brake to set it. And I find that there's a little clip on the bottom there, but if you put it in like part way, turn it 90 degrees, and then turn it back, it comes out easy. So going in, it goes down. Actually, that's good enough right there. that's how that goes in. I'm doing it several times so you can see how it goes. Once you get it this far in, because of this cutout here, it hits on this backing plate and it can't come out. So it's made that way, and it seems to be a fairly good design because it maintains its these are 9/16 to take the backing plate off, and then there's one, it's a 3/4, and there's two tabs here that need to be bent back so that you can take that off. And these are the bolts that they go in through the back of the trailing arm. They're studs, actually, they're not bolts. And make sure that you don't break these off, because that wouldn't be good. So I'm probably going to have to work those back and forth for a while to get them off without breaking them. So I am going to turn off the video and turn it back on at the next step. Going to clean these up as best I can before I take them off. Hopefully that'll make it easier to take them off. That made it easier to get the socket on that one, at least. It's still pretty tight. Might have to put it in the vise to be able to hold it steady while I put some torque on it. So I've gotten the 4 bolts off of that go through the back of the trailing arm, and now we're down to this last 3/4 inch bolt here. There's a little retainer that's a dual purpose thing right here. It's got bendable clips so that you can lock that 3/4 inch bolt in so it doesn't loosen. But the other purpose of it is the tops of the brake shoes sit behind these tabs. Hopefully this isn't too hard to get up. It's going to be stubborn. Now, that being a 3/4 bolt, I'm not afraid to use the air ratchet on it, or the impact wrench, I should say. So that's what I'm going to do. So this impact wrench should make short work of that. Helps to put a socket on it. So there's a bolt with a 3/4 head. I always say 3/4 inch bolt. I'm referring to the wrench size when I say that. I don't really know what the size of the bolt is. Looks like a half maybe. Okay, you'll notice this has two little tabs on the inside of it. There's a slot. Can't get it to focus on there. I think you can see the two slots there. Oops. Trying to get my arm there to have some contrast and I drop everything. So there you can see the two tabs. They go in slots that are in this little thing here. And that's got to come out so that I can get the backing plate off. I have to try to put maybe a crescent wrench on that. See if I can focus in on that. That's the thing that's holding the backing plate on now. That's all that. Oh, there you go. It comes out of the back easy. So that's the backing plate off, and my little pin that holds the brake shoe on went flying. I'll have to make sure I find that. And I'll put it through the hole in there and put the retainer on it. So there's still 3 pieces here. You have the trailing arm. You have, I guess this is the carrier, and then you have the spindle here that holds the shock mount and strut bar. What I found the easiest way, and I'll see if I can get a picture of it, there is just a tiny bit of wiggle room here on the in between the bolts, and that it's really small on this one. It was bigger on my 74. But what I find is that instead of trying to pry that off, I took a hammer and I hit it and drove it rotationally back and forth, one way then the other, and that broke the rust bond, and then it came off pretty easy. Okay, you can see already I've got it broken loose, and it just took a couple minutes of relatively light tapping. But I'll point out these 2 places where you can see separation here and over here. And what I'm going to do now, and I'm running out of battery, but I'll slowly tap that up, and I will get something under the other side here, a screwdriver or something, to pry up as I tap on one side and pry on the other, and it will come out. So that's coming off very easily now. I didn't even have to tap it really. And to break it loose, what I was doing is I was basically tapping this way, that way, over here this way, repeat, and within a very short period of time, it came loose. So that's that. The only thing left now is to separate the trailing arm from the spindle support, and it looks like that can be done the same way. I'm going to try to get a little putty knife and try to drive it under there. See if I can get it started. I must have put things away in a hurry one day because I found my pair of pliers I was looking for in the wrong drawer, and my putty knife was in the wrong drawer. So I had a better putty knife for this at one time. It had a metal blade that went all the way through the end. This one's rubber on the end and it's kind of bouncing. I'm gonna have to get something better. Maybe I'll try the air hammer with just the hammer thing on it. See if that dislodges it. Okay, I've got the spindle part in a vise, and I've got the air hammer. I've been hitting it alternately on each side. There you have it. Trailing arm is, at least the first one, is completely disassembled. That's how you go about it, or how I went about it. Now I'll be able to paint those up properly and make them look good and put them back together. So unless I find something different on the other one, I'm done videoing for the trailing arm disassembly. I'm just going to do the same thing on the other side. Oh, I may come back later and show how to take out the front bushing. So a little bit about how it goes back together, so we don't forget. Shock mount, this is the driver's side of the car. Shock mount points into the inside of the car. Trailing arm goes on that side with the bolts pointing to the outside. And then shock mount, recall we took the big bolt out of the top. That goes through the top of the trailing arm, and the caliper mount bolts, this offset goes towards the inside of the car. So that's how it goes back together when it becomes time to do that. Just like that. And then of course the parking brake, etc., gets put on top of it. Zoom in on that a little bit. Trailing arm, spindle, I guess I'll call it, caliper mount. So we're getting ready to press the bushing out of the trailing arm. There's two washers on here, and they're what prevents the bushing from sliding in there. So we've got to get one of those sides off so that we can press it out. And I think maybe I decided I'm going to do the other side. But before we try that, just to try and make it less that I'm going to have to cut through, because there's a bushing here that's flared over that holds those in. So if I can punch the remainder of the trailing arm bolt out of there, then that'll be less that I have to grind off. Didn't turn on the air this morning. That's actually not moving anything. So I'm going to have to grind it all off and then remove those washers. Have this set up to grind up. Holding it in the other hand from the last thing I did. It's actually getting pretty warm on my hand because it's shooting the sparks at me. I think I'll switch directions. All I've got to do is get enough of that off of there so I can get those two washers off. Not sure how much that is. Top washer is spinning. So pretty sure that one's going to come off easily. Don't want to touch it because it's going to be hot. Should grab a pair of needle nose pliers or something. These jaws are kind of big to get in there. I'm gonna just get a chisel and knock that out. Should come off with the chisel. I don't know if both will, but the front one certainly will. And that will allow me, even if the second one doesn't come off, that will allow me to get a better shot at grinding off what's left of the bushing that's holding it in. Looks like it might be loose enough. You can smell the rubber burning. That would come off by now. Grind it some more. Son of a gun's in there tight. It'll take some more grinding. Would have thought that would have come out by now. A lot of the off of there. I might have to do that to the other side as well, because I need to put a cup or something to allow me to press it out. To support that control. Peeling off as much of this rubber while it's warm, and I can grab it. And that leaves me with just the actual rubber that's inside the thing. And now I may be able to punch that out with the air hammer. Because now it's not the washer that's holding it, it's just the rubber bushing. Well, that bushing came out. Now all I got to do is get the rest of the rubber out. Okay. That turned out to be just as easy as setting up the press once I got the part that was bent over that was holding those washers on. It was actually pretty easy. Now, these are required in there for the polyurethane bushings that I'm going to put in. I do not know if you're replacing the rubber bushings, if you need to leave that in there or not. I suspect you do, but I don't know that for a fact. So last night, after thinking about what I had done for the day, I decided that doing these videos the way I do, where I shut off the camera here and there, I kind of don't give a sense of how long this is going to take. So I decided, just for grins, I'm going to take this. Now, recall I had already knocked this spindle out, but I'm going to take this whole trailing arm apart and let the camera run the whole time so that you can see just exactly how long it takes to take one of these apart. Hopefully I will get this thing in the frame and not block the view too much. And the other thing that it will do is, I know that whenever I talk about doing some of this stuff, I really, I do something, but I do it off camera and then explain what I did. So this is going to be actually doing it, since I already have the other explanation. There's one clip off of the parking brake. And this was the one, you can't reach in there behind it. So I kind of had to hold that little tab with one hand or one tool, I should say, and use another tool to push back the retainer and the spring and then twist it. That's really close to coming out. Okay, so that's how you do it with two tools. Then, as you recall, yesterday, and I guess this is going to take a little bit longer than just straight doing it because I am doing some explaining as I'm going along. After I got those clips off, it was easy to just spread the parking brake shoes out and take off. Okay, it's not so easy with that top spring in place. I know I did this on my 74. Came off. It was a little more trouble than I remembered, but it came off. And then there's the parking brake actuator that you have to pick it up and slide it over. That's off. We're down to I think my pin fell out, so I'm going to have to be careful that I don't lose that. Although, oh, there it is. Although, because that one spring broke yesterday, I think I will end up buying new springs. Yesterday, I took those off with a ratchet. Today I'm going to use the impact wrench. A little bit more confident that these are going to come out easily because this one's been apart since the last one. But even so, I'm not putting the impact wrench on full power, but I don't want to I do not want to break those studs, but they're coming off nicely. And I have forgotten that a couple of the tools that again, I have to bend the tab back on this retainer here. As I was taking those parking brake shoes off, thought occurred to me that I would make it a little bit easier had I taken that adjuster screw out first. And that's easy to do, just by threading the bottom of the brakes and removing it. It just fits into a couple grooves there. But the big thing is whenever I'm doing this, and I say I tapped on this or that, yeah, I did. But you don't get a sense for how long and how hard. With this one, since I'm doing it all on video, there should be a sense of how long and how hard. So the next thing is to take this spindle off and a matter of breaking the rust bond between it and the carrier. So there's an idea of how easily that came off. And yesterday's, even though it had not been taken apart as recently as this, it was about that easy. Okay, now I'm opening up the vise to get this in. And I can tell this one's going to come off easy. I did hit that with a hammer here and there yesterday. So there you have it. I am not going to include the taking out of the bushing because I just did that and I showed that in real time. So I may just include this. I was thinking about maybe doing that as a separate video, but it's so short I may just include it with the video that I did yesterday.